On Tuesday, 31st December 1929, hundreds of children flocked to the cinema in Paisley to watch the matinee, a western called Desperado Jude. The day would end as Scotland's worst cinema disaster. The Glen Cinema in Paisley had been opened since 1901 and was a popular draw for both adults and children. As it was Hogmanay, it was surmised the cinema was so packed because parents wanted peace to get on and prepare the house for the night's festivities. The children ranged in age up to around 15 years old. The film operator at the time was 20-year-old Alexander Rosie. When it was time to change the film reel to the second one in the projection room, the first reel was placed in its metal canister and put in the spool room. After a short time, Rosie, who'd just started playing the second reel, began to smell burning film and saw smoke as it wafted into his box at the back of the auditorium. By this time, the assistant film operator James McVeigh had noticed smoke emanating from one of the film canisters in the rewinding room. He'd placed it next to the accumulator when he saw it. The 15-year-old took the canister out of the rewinding room into a passage where he tried to stop it smouldering by covering it, but its lid sprang open, with flames, smoke and fumes billowing into the passage. He ran to Rosie, who told him to get the manager immediately. The film was then thrown out onto a piece of waste ground, out of harm's way, by Charles Dorward, the cinema's manager. The auditorium where the children were was filled with only a little smoke by the gallery, but the cry of fire was shouted by a boy in the audience. The result of this was sheer panic. The children were up at the stage end of the auditorium, and on the steps leading down from it, there was a solid mass of children, packed and jammed together. The children began running to the exits. One of these led on to Dyer's Wynd, but as the children rushed forward, some fell, and soon they piled up behind the door, making it impossible to open. It had been designed to open inwards rather than outwards, but even if it had been outward opening, it was claimed it had been locked by a padlock to stop other children getting into the cinema to watch the films for free. Children also suffered injuries from those jumping from the balcony onto the seats below to escape. Meanwhile, Rosie heard children screaming and found himself in a passage filled with thick black smoke, meaning he had to grope his way along. He found some children and took them out by the side door, then re-entered a few more times to lead children to safety. A number of police officers and civilians also helped at this area of the cinema. Rosie then returned to the main auditorium, going round the passage behind the stage and flicking on the red lights, then helped in the rescue operation already underway with the help of more police officers, firemen and civilians. A police officer who'd arrived on the scene later testified that he believed the gates had been padlocked, but one of the survivors stated she'd seen the cinema's manager, Dorward, unlock them. Another policeman managed to break one of the padlocks, but again the door opened inwards and the children piled up as they tried to escape. During the mayhem, some children remained in their seats, and this saved their lives. They were later evacuated by firefighters. As a result of the disaster, 69 children initially lost their lives, with around 40 or so injured. With the exception of one death, the children who died had been asphyxiated in the scramble to safety, as none had shown any signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. The dead and injured were taken to the Royal Alexandra Infirmary in Paisley, where another child, 15-year-old James Guilty, succumbed to his injuries the following day, taking the total to 70 young lives lost in the tragedy. The doctors, including Dr. Gray and a visiting surgeon, Dr. William Tellett, did all they could to save the children, including artificial resuscitation, not giving up until there was no hope of survival. 5 families lost 2 or more children in the tragedy, with 16 of the victims having attended the same school, St. James Roman Catholic School. Their funerals took place on Friday 3rd January. Almost immediately, a relief fund was set up by Paisley Provost Craig Barr to help the bereaved families and injured children, and the council offered the survivors a week's holiday by the sea. Messages of sympathy flooded in, including one from George V and his wife, Queen Mary, and from the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. Lord Provost Kelly of Glasgow telegrammed, "In my own name, and on behalf of the citizens of Glasgow, many of whom have very close associations with Paisley, I send you and all concerned an expression of my profound sorrow and grief at the terrible calamity which yesterday occurred in your town, resulting in the loss of so many young lives." On Wednesday, 1st January 1930, it was announced that the Procurator Fiscal would be holding an inquiry into the disaster, and a few days later, Dorward was arrested and appeared at Paisley Sheriff Court, where he was committed to trial, but granted bail on a £750 bond. Some of the children spoke about their experiences. One of these was Nellie McGinnigal. She had gone to the cinema with her friend, Mary Robertson. She said they had only seen part of the first film when they smelt something burning. Mary had turned round and saw flames coming from the room where the films were kept. The shout of fire went up, and the other boys and girls jumped from their seats and rushed to the back door. She went on to say they'd been killed because they were trampled on when they'd tumbled. She too fell, but Mary grabbed her and hauled her up. Then she lost sight of her friend due to the thick black smoke. Mary became one of the victims. Nellie fell, and the next thing she knew she was being carried by a gentleman and found herself at the police station where she saw other children. Had it not been for Mary, she said, she would have died that day. Mrs. Brain, the mother of 8-year-old Caroline Brain, spoke of how she and her husband had been standing at the cross when the disaster happened. Caroline, an only child, had last been seen with her friends, 8-year-olds Mary Dolan and Elizabeth Leonard, as they were running down the street arm in arm, laughing, excited at going to see the film. The Brains saw a man staggering from the building with a child in his arms, and when Mr. Brain ran forward to help him, he saw the child the stranger was carrying was his daughter. She was dead. Her 2 friends also lost their lives that day. On Tuesday, 29th April, at the High Court in Edinburgh, Dorward, originally from Brechin, stood trial on the indictment of failing in his duty to ensure the exits were in proper order by keeping the iron trellis gate at one of them locked, and the charge of culpable homicide. He stood before the Lord Justice Clerk Robert Munro, Lord Alness, with the Lord Advocate Craig Aitchison, assisted by Advocate John Cameron, later Lord Cameron, prosecuting on behalf of the Crown. It transpired during the proceedings that on that morning of the disaster, the cinema had been inspected by the Paisley Fire Brigade and found to be safe. One of the firefighters, John Byrne, had examined the crushed doors, but not the trellis gate, as this was a security feature and not deemed a fire hazard at the time. During the trial, the owner of the cinema, James Graham, agreed that there weren't enough exits, but claimed he repeatedly told Dorward the exits should not be closed and locked during the screening. It was also during the inquiry Dorward admitted to them being locked to prevent free viewing by children. It was concluded that the cause of the disaster had been the canister that had been placed on top of a battery in the spool room, where it caught fire. It was further concluded that had there been more exits, more attendance at the venue, and less children, the resulting deaths could have been avoided. One of the witnesses at the trial was 17-year-old cashier Anna Graham McFarlane. She claimed that if the boy who'd shouted fire hadn't done so, then she believed she and Dorward could have calmed the children down. It was also suggested that if McVeigh had taken the film outside as soon as he'd noticed it, the disaster wouldn't have unfolded. On Friday, 2nd May, the jury retired and after less than half an hour returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict. Dorward was found not guilty. It was following this disaster that tighter measures were put in place at cinemas to prevent anything like this happening again, including emergency doors that push outwards. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.